Hello, and welcome to Burns Banter, the podcast that takes a fresh look at the life and works of Robert Burns, hosted by myself, Alistair Turnbull. Now, in last week's episode, we looked at Robert up until he was the age of 15, when he'd just written his first poem, which was called Handsome Nell. And he was living at a farm called Mount Oliphant with his mum and dad and his brothers and sisters. And it was quite a difficult farm to live on, quite a lot of hard work, and they weren't doing particularly well there. In this episode, we're going to look at a farm called Lochlea, because they moved there after they were in Mount Oliphant. I'm going to see, was it a better farm? Was it a worse farm? Have they improved their situation? Is it worse now than it was before? Listen on and you'll find out. At the same time, what's Robert doing with himself at this point in his life? He's like late teenage years. How is he developing? And I'm going to talk about things like the Tarbolton Bachelors Club. I'll also talk about a trip that he did. He went to Irvine. He went to Irvine for a few months. I lived there, tried to do a thing called flax dressing. You'll find out all about that in this episode. And the fourth thing I want to talk about is the poems. What kind of poems is he writing just now? What kind of state is he in? Is he feeling happy? Is he feeling sad? That's reflected in the poems that he writes just now. So let's dive in and let's look at Lochlea, the farm that they're staying at now. Okay, so again, in the previous episode, the first farm that they lived in was a place called Mount Oliphant, but it wasn't a particularly great farm. It was very difficult to grow anything there. So in 1777, William Burns uprooted his family again, and they moved to a farm called Lochlea. Now, that's a 130-acre farm, and it's about 2.5 miles outside of Tarbolton. It was owned by an Ayrshire merchant called David McClure. And William had struck a bargain with David to rent the farm, and it was all verbal. There was nothing written down. And he said to David, the land needs to be improved. It's very acidic, so he had to put lime down, so that was going to cost him money. And he said, can I have that against my rent? And David said, yeah, that's fine. That'll be against your rent. That's okay. And also there was a loch on the farm as well. It was a deliberately flooded land. A part of the farm at Lochlea was deliberately flooded because they used the water to power a mill. And then William said, well, I'm not going to pay rent on that piece of land because it's 20 acres that I can't use. And David went, yeah, that's fine, that's okay. And that was fine for a while, until David McClure, the guy that owned the farm, fell into debt. He fell into quite a lot of debt. And he then started to say to William Burns, Robert's father, well, you owe me back rent. You owe me rent for that land under the water. And William said, well, we agreed that I wasn't going to pay that. But he said, I need the rent. I need the money. And then he said, well, I want all the rent that you should have been giving me. But William said, well, we agreed that I was going to take some of that money and use it to improve the land. And you agreed to that. Well, I need the money now. Eventually, it dragged on for a couple of years. But David McClure then said that William and the Burns family owed him about £500, some ridiculous sum like that. He took them to court. And as well as all the hard work during the day, William, Robert's father, is now fighting this court case against David McClure. And eventually, William wins the court case. He didn't have to pay the money because the judge fell in his favour and said, you don't owe this money. It was all in the verbal agreement, which is great. It's all cleared. But they had to pay a lot of money in lawyers. And then, unfortunately, David McClure, because he was in so much debt, he was taken to court by his creditors, and William Burns was dragged into that one because William Burns was a debtor tenant of David McClure, so he was dragged into the courts again through no fault of his own. But I'll tell you about the end of that in the next episode, okay? So the farm they're on is a bit better. It's better than Mount Oliphant. They're growing more. They're actually growing various things, including a crop called flax. And as I say, better than Mount Oliphant, not too bad. So what's Robert doing at this time? How is Robert developing? He's coming into his sort of later teenage years. What's he up to? So let's have a look at that in the next part of the podcast. Right, so what's Robert up to? He's about 17, 18 at this point. He's working full-time on the farm at Lochlea with his brother Gilbert and his dad. But he's seeing the amount of work his dad is doing and the toll it's taking on him. And Robert really doesn't see himself doing that for the rest of his life. He could see that it's not the life that he wants. So he starts to kind of break away from his dad a bit. And the first small sign of rebellion against his dad was he said to his father that in 1779 he wanted to go to some country dance lessons that were taking place in Tarbolton. Now, it's just a country dance club. That's all he wanted to go to. But his dad was dead set against it. I don't think he'd ever done country dancing in his life. Pardon me. But eventually he relented and let Robert go. And Gilbert went as well, and a few other of his brothers and sisters. And it was just held in a room in Tarbolton. And it was just country dancing. But when Robert was there, he learned how to dance, which was great. But I think he realised his manners were very rough. He spent all of his years on a farm working. And when he got to more polite society, which is what was happening in Tarbolton with the dance club, I think he found it difficult to keep up in conversation with them. Even though he was well read, he wasn't used to having a lot of conversation. And then a couple of months later, in fact, it was almost about a year later, and the year was, what was the year? 1780. On the 11th of November 1780, Robert and a few other of his friends, including Gilbert, formed the Tarbolton Bachelors Club. Now, the Tarbolton Bachelors Club was a debating society. Basically, they wanted to get some skill in speaking and speaking in public. I think he found himself wanting in that department and wanted to get better. So they formed a society. And they held their meetings in a place in Tarbolton. It was actually the first floor of an alehouse owned by a guy called John Richard. And it's actually the same room that they went to for the country dancing in 1779. So they formed a society. It's Robert, Gilbert, and the other original members were Hugh Reid, Alexander Brown, Thomas Wright, William McGavin, and Walter Mitchell. And later on that year, David Siller joined as well. As I say, it's a debating society. It's not they haven't formed a bachelors club to go out drinking and having a good time. They did a lot of that as well, but this was to brush up their manners and how they speak to people. So they had rules for this club. They had 10 rules. One of the rules, number 6, was no swearing, no profanity. Rule number 7 was not to mention the club's affairs to anyone outside of the club, which to me sounds a bit Masonic, very mysterious. And actually the last rule, rule number 10, which I believe Robert wrote because it just sounds like him. It's quite a long rule. I'll read it to you. It is, every man proper for a member of this society must have a frank, honest, open heart, above anything dirty or mean, and must be a professed lover of one or more of the female sex. No haughty, self-conceited person who looks upon himself as superior to the rest of the club, and especially no mean-spirited, worldly mortal whose only will is to heap up money, shall upon any pretence whatsoever be admitted. So they were looking for just honest people who wanted to speak and learn and improve themselves. That's what they were looking for. So what did they debate at this? What kind of subjects did they talk about at this society? Well, one of the things that they debated was whether we derive more happiness from love or from friendship. So do you get more happiness from someone you love, or do you get more happiness from someone who's just a very good friend? That was one of the things that they debated. Another thing that they debated, and there was a minute to this effect, was who would you marry? Was it basically they were asking, would you marry for money or would you marry for love? But the way they put it was, if a young farmer had the chance of marrying 2 women, one woman being a wealthy woman, but is neither attractive nor good at conversation nor agreeable in any way, would you marry her? Or would you marry someone who is very pleasant to the eye, great at conversation, someone you get on with very well, but has no money? So basically, would you marry for money or would you marry for love? And Robert actually debated on behalf of the lassie without any money. He went for, you should marry for love. So those are the kind of things they debated. They also debated topics of the time as well. You know, if there's something in a newspaper that they'd heard about, they would debate that. They didn't debate anything religious. That's a bit too close to the bone. I don't think that was allowed, really. It'd be too rebellious to do that. And at the end of each meeting, they toasted the mistresses of the club. Now, get your mind out of the gutter. It's not what you think. The mistresses of the club are the mothers of each household. So basically, at the end of each meeting, they gave a toast to their mums, which I think is very nice. So again, that society was just there to help him get better debating skills, better public speaking skills. That's why that was there. Let's leave that bit there, and now let's look at Robert's trip to Irvine. As I said before, Robert and Gilbert grew a crop called flax at Lochlea. Now, you've probably never heard of flax before because it's not really used now. What it was grown and then it was processed and then it was woven into linen. Basically, it was just a crop, and to process it, you had to soak it, then dry it, then get two heckling combs and scrape off the outer husk of the plant. It was the inner fibres that were then straightened and woven together to use as linen, as cloth. Now, Robert really didn't want to be a farmer. As I said again before, he was seeing the toll it was taking on his father. He did not want that life. So he decided to go to Irvine to become a flax dresser, which is basically process the flax before it becomes linen. Irvine at the time was a busy, bustling seaport, very important. A lot of things going on in Irvine. It's a bit quieter there now, but at the time it was a very busy commercial port. And he went and he worked in a flax dressing shop in Glasgow Vennel in Irvine. And he actually went there and he worked alongside a guy called Andrew Peacock and his wife. Now, Andrew Peacock is actually his mother's half-brother. That's the introduction. I think that's how he got to go and work there. His mum must have asked her half-brother, can Robert come along and try flax dressing? And he's obviously said yes. Now, it turns out Andrew Peacock isn't a particularly nice guy. Robert said that he earned his money through the mystery of thieving and all the rest of it. He didn't think he was a nice guy at all. And Robert actually hated flax dressing when he got there. He worked again in Glasgow Vennel, and for the first wee while he stayed in the loft of the place he was flax dressing. Then he moved, I think it was number 4 Glasgow Vennel for his lodgings. But then the actual flax dressing itself is really bad for you, because you're banging away at these bits of crusted stuff to scrape it away and get the threads and comb them out, and there's dust and there's smoke, and it really gets in your lungs and it really gets in your eyes. A lot of people who did flax dressing developed really bad lung conditions and died from it. It wasn't a great thing to be doing. Robert hated it, and he became unwell when he was in Irvine, really unwell. I mean, he went away in the October. In the November, he was so unwell that his father came to visit him. And he was quite depressed as well, I think. But by December, they had to call for a doctor. And you have to be you have to be almost dying by the time before they call for a doctor back then. So they called for a doctor, and Dr. Charles Fleming turned up and saw him. And Dr. Fleming saw Burns 5 times in 8 days. And that tells me that Burns was particularly unwell. Now, Dr. Fleming gave him some drugs. There's a drug that I've written down here. It's basically 2 plants from South America that were dried and put together. I'll try and pronounce it. It's Ep3. It's basically a cough mixture, pointing towards Burns having bad lungs from the flax dressing. But the active ingredient in that is emetine, which is actually still used in cough mixtures today. So maybe the doctor did particularly well there. But then he prescribed him something else, which I'm not sure what it was, but it was for either high fever or typhoid or smallpox. Now, the reason he would do that, because in 1781 in Irvine, there was an outbreak of typhoid and smallpox. It's a seaport. You're going to get exotic diseases in a seaport, you know. So he prescribed a lot of other things, one of which was very, very poisonous if you take too much of it, and particularly poisonous for your heart. So possibly that didn't help Robert in later years either, as you'll find out towards the end of this podcast. Anyway, Robert got a bit better. He went back to the flax dressing, but in December of that year, a disaster happened, an absolute disaster. They were having a wee bit of a party in the flax dressing business, and Andrew Peacock's wife got a bit drunk and knocked over a candle and basically set the place on fire and burnt it to the ground. So all the money that they had and all the investment that they had and all the effort and work that they'd put into it had gone. It was literally burnt to the ground. He was penniless. Not a good time so far in Irvine. It wasn't all bad though. As I say, he did get a bit better. He came out of his depression. He came out of his illness. And he met a few people in Irvine that really influenced him in later life. He met a gentleman called William Templeton. William Templeton owned a bookshop in the High Street in Irvine at the time. And in there, there was newspapers, there was songs in print. But most importantly of all, that was where Robert Burns first read the works of Robert Fergusson. Now, Robert Fergusson's another Scottish poet that died not long before Burns. He was basically almost a contemporary of Burns. And that's where he first read it, in that high street shop in Irvine. Burns got on really well with William Templeton. It's said that he had a favourite seat at the back of the shop, and he used to sit and read there for hours and hours and hours. And the seat actually still exists. The Templeton family took it with them to Australia when they moved to Australia, and then they brought it back when they came back, and it's still in existence today. As is the place where he did the flax dressing. Well, the walls are still there, everything else burnt down. He also spent a bit of time at William Templeton's house and received good hospitality there. The one other person that he met in Irvine that was a very good influence on him was a guy called Captain William Brown, a seafaring captain. And he and Burns got on very well, and Burns found out a lot about the world from William Brown, because either William Brown had been there or he knew people that had been there. He talked to Burns about America and Africa and different places all round about, and they used to talk about great subjects. The other thing about William Brown was Robert said that he's the only man he's ever met that was a greater fool when women were involved, was William Brown. Now, Robert was pretty involved with women, but if William Brown was even worse, then that's pretty bad. William Brown was one of the guys that first encouraged Robert to write down his poems, because at the time, Robert was writing poetry, yeah, but it was just for his friends, it was just for family, it was just for letters he was sending to people. He didn't even think about publishing. But William Brown said, you should write a book. You should put your poems down in a book, and it'd be great. Unfortunately, at that time, he didn't. He just kept on writing poems for himself. And he ended up back at Lochlea. He, in his own words, he ended up back at Lochlie in the spirit of a true poet, with not two coins to rub together. But he had learned a lot when he was in Irvine. He'd lived in a town for the first time. Overall, I think it was a good thing. Although, as I said, he was quite depressed when he had his illness there. Right, so he's back at Lochlie. In the next section, let's look at the poetry he's been writing over this period of time. Right, let's have a look at the poems that Robert's writing at this time. Again, he's in his sort of late teens, beginning to get his 20s. He's not having a great time again. He's working hard on the farm. He's working hard as a flax dresser. He's losing everything. Nothing's going well for him. So, not surprisingly, he's not writing particularly happy poetry. It's all kind of dirges and stuff like that. Some of the ones he wrote were quite nice. He wrote, "O Tibby, I hae seen the day, one night as I did wander." The Lass of Cessnock Banks. That was one he tried to introduce himself to a richer girl, and it didn't really work. He wrote a poem called "A Prayer in the Prospect of Death." Now, I think it's basically him saying, "I've done wrong, and I'm probably going to die. I'm going to see God quite soon." I think he wrote that when he was really ill in Irvine, and he thought he might pass away. So I think that's when he wrote that one. But the one I'm going to read to you is it's called "Winter a Dirge," because it's really quite emotional, this one. He gets some good feeling into it. It shows he's getting better at writing. Before I read that one to you, though, there was another one called what's it called again? "The Death and Dying Words of Poor Mealy." Now, Mealy was his pet sheep, basically. And this poem is one of his first forays into writing poetry in the Scots language. It's quite a reasonably long poem, and he takes on the persona of the sheep as she's dying. She's tied to a peg in the middle of the farmyard and hurts herself, and she thinks she's dying. And she then tries to impart knowledge, tell my poor lambs this and tell them that, and make sure they don't do this and make sure they do that. And it's quite a parody on sort of social niceties of the time, and it's definitely worth the read, but a bit too long for me to read to you here. Now, as I say, the one I'm going to read to you is "Winter a Dirge," because I think it's one of his better ones at the time. But as by the name of the poem, it's not the happiest of subjects. So here it is. The wintry west extends his blast, and hail and rain does blaw, or the stormy north sends driving forth the blinding sleet and snow. While tumbling brown the burn comes down, and roars fae bank to brae, and bird and beast in covert rest, and pass the heartless day. The sweeping blast, the skies o'ercast, the joyless winter day, let others fear, to me more dear than all the pride in May. The tempest's howl, it soothes my soul, my griefs it seems to join. The leafless tree my fancy please, their fate resembles mine. Thou power supreme, whose mighty scheme those woes of mine fulfil, here firm I rest, they must be best, because they are thy will. Then all I want, O do thou grant this one request of mine, since to enjoy thou dost deny, assist me to resign. In other words, if I can't enjoy the winter day, just please help me get through it. That's the sentiment in that one there. Please help me get through it. He's always complaining about the coldness of the winters, but actually between the years of 1550 and the 1780s or around about that time, it was actually known as the Mini Ice Age. And particularly in the 1780s, the winters were very, very bad. So maybe he's got a point to be complaining about them. There were other poems, but you can read and find out about them. They just look up the dates and they should come up if you look them on the internet. I think I'm going to leave the episode there. So we're still at Lochlea. We've had time in Irvine with Robert. He's formed the Tarbolton Bachelors Club. He's trying to get better at speaking. He's trying to brush up his manners. William, his father, is embroiled in a second legal battle. Where do they go from here? What happens in next week's episode? Does William win the battle? What does Robert do? Where does he go next? Does he stay a farmer? Tune in next week and find out then. But until then, Slàinte mhath.